Hey guys, this is my presentation on Notes from the Underground, chapters 9 through 12. This section finishes the underground section of the book and leads into the apropos of the wet snow section, which is written as more of a narrative than a diary or a collection of notes, as the narrator himself actually talks about in detail in the last chapter, chapter 11. So far, I think this is a very interesting book, especially reading it while I'm under a quarantine. It's kind of hitting a bit harder than it would if I was not in this situation, but like all philosophical books, it's going to be relatable in any circumstance, I think. So before we start talking about the chapters themselves, I figured I'd start off with some background on Dostoevsky as a guy and the circumstances surrounding the book and what Dostoevsky was kind of experiencing while he was writing. A lot of this overlaps with some of the things that Benjamin included in his presentation, but I do think that this stuff is important enough to hear twice. Dostoevsky was a Russian writer who was born in Moscow, but who moved to St. Petersburg, where he lived for the rest of his life. He lived in the 1800s, which was a very eventful time in Russia, because before Dostoevsky himself was born, Russia had experienced the Napoleonic Wars, which threw it into a little bit of a chaos, as a lot of the dysfunction inherent in the imperial Russian system was uncovered. Dostoevsky himself lived and grew up while Russia was following an official principle of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, which basically sought unity of the Russian Empire under the Orthodox Church and the absolute authority of the Tsar. This led to waves and waves of protests, both by nobility and by the common people, most notably the anarchist and nihilist movements, which kind of flourished during this time. Dostoevsky was writing in the middle of the Russian nihilist movement, which rejected all authority, and as a political group, eventually became known for their very violent means of producing change. Their political action really culminated in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. Yes. And even though Dostoevsky was writing in the midst of nihilism, Notes from the Underground is a solidly existentialist book, often cited to be the first piece of existentialist literature. The Underground Man himself is the one credited with existentialism's creation, as it's really through his diary and his notes that we can see an example of existentialism playing out. The Underground Man as a character is unable to fit into society and is consistently unhappy with the varying identities he applies to himself. He is chronically dissatisfied with whatever he chooses to be, making him a very good example of a man wrought with existentialism. Going back to Dostoevsky himself, he was arrested in 1848 for being part of a group of people, like a book club, of people who discussed banned books which were critical of the Tsar and the Tsarist institution. For this crime, he was originally sentenced to death, but eventually he ended up serving 4 years in a Siberian prison camp and 6 years after that in compulsory military service in exile. He also, prior to his arrest, he graduated from Russia's Military Engineering Institute in St. Petersburg and was a lieutenant engineer in the army before he became a writer and philosopher in 1843. Which, as we saw in the video, he struggled a bit trying to get off his feet when he first started writing, but he did eventually become quite an influential writer. we can see him being influenced by his life in simple things, like the underground man's characterization, and little things, details about his life. The underground man, for example, staunchly insists on living in St. Petersburg and nowhere else. And he is a college assessor, just like Dostoevsky's father and older brother were. More interestingly than these small cosmetic details is Dostoevsky's time as a prisoner. He spent 10 years in exile, far away from society and all of his contemporary writers, all of his friends, and all of his family. And I definitely think that this experience is very, very much connected to the underground man's own isolation from society as a whole, and the time he has spent underground, which shaped his attitude as a bitter and spiteful man. While these aren't the same situation, considering that Dostoevsky's exile was involuntary, and the underground man seemingly stays in exile because he cannot stand humanity as a whole, I do think that a lot of the ideas that Dostoevsky uses here did come out of his time alone and abandoned by the society around him. Also, Dostoevsky's past as an engineer is very interesting to me, especially relating to the underground man's distaste for mathematical rationality. Throughout the first part of Notes from the Underground man actively repels rationality, embodied in the idea that 2 by 2 equals 4 without fail. The underground man thinks that this is a very limiting ideology and doesn't really apply to humanity the same way it does to mathematics. Dostoevsky, who went to school for engineering but found a passion for philosophy and writing, has very intimate experiences with cold and rational thinking that applies to engineering. He has the underground man apply this rationality of math, of science, and of nature to humanity as a whole, and finds that the laws of engineering don't apply to people and their irrational actions.